So thank you all. I'm very impressed by the number of people who are happy to avoid going to work on Tuesday morning to talk. I had actually, when Pauline suggested that the best time to do this would be Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, I thought, why does she think this is a good idea? So we'll do our best with this. It's really unfortunate that it's sunny in Paris today. Usually it's really sunny. But hopefully this will work. This is a question. So I'll give you one brief context for this talk. I have been teaching a course on information design history at Northeastern University in Boston for about 4 years now. This is a one-semester course, and I put together this talk, about 50 minutes, by trying to compress everything from this one-semester course. So there are a lot of images, and I will be talking about a lot of examples. I actually have a script because there's so many things here. I need to remember what it is I'm supposed to say. So I do know what I'm talking about, but I will have to fumble with the paper sometimes. So I call this seeing the differences because information is a difference which makes a difference. The information designer selects and encodes information. So we're studying examples of information design from many periods and many cultures, so it will help us understand how to shape hierarchies and networks, create patterns that connect. And patterns that connect are the pathways for accessing differences. So I was looking at this image, and the composition of these crossing lines with their slightly irregular patterns, it made me think of this image, which is a train diagram, which is a lot like this image. And then I thought, how striking that these three examples are similar in the way they use lines to create visual patterns, but the information in the patterns is found in very different relationships. In Murray's diagram, the one on the top left here, the background grid represents the intersection of time and stations in space. That's the time of trains going from Paris to Lyon. The bottom line is Lyon, the top line is Paris. And the information about the relative speed of the trains is in the slope of the line. So the greater the slope of the line, the faster the train. In Becks Diagram, the background represents London around the River Thames. Those colored lines represent subway routes, and the text represents the station names, and those diamond symbols represent transfer points. The information about how to move between any two stations is represented by a combination of line color, station name, and transfer marks. The slope of the lines carries no information at all. And this is a redwood chart. The background here is the ocean around the Marshall Islands in the South Pacific. And the lines are the ocean swells created by the interaction between prevailing winds and the islands that are represented by those shells, which you see as sort of white dots on there. The information about how to move between the islands is represented by the number of lines that will be crossed by a boat. And the line slope represents the direction of the wind driving the wave to be crossed. So all three of these are elegant solutions to a problem of transportation diagrams. These were all transportation diagrams. They look alike, yet they use the same elements for very dissimilar purposes. They're all designed to communicate that the human mind where the patterns of differences connect the viewer to a solution to a problem. So to present this as a new history, I need to construct a frame for understanding where the history takes place. And the examples that we'll examine come from many eras and many cultures. I want to establish the largest possible frame within which we can examine these common features to see how it applies to current visual communication. So I'm going to begin by reviewing several frames that have been used to contextualize and value these examples. So frame one, I think many people here are familiar with this frame. It's the history of graphic methods for visualizing quantitative data. That history actually begins with this book by Menard. I'll ask for hands up. How many people know who Etienne Menard is? One person, okay. Well, he's a remarkable French scientist, and he produced a book, which you can still get online. I believe you can download it from the BNF and a couple of other libraries, the Method Graphique. And that book was really the beginning of this reflection on how to visualize data. It becomes popular in computer graphics tools as you reach a large audience in the 1990s. And the examples in this frame come from social and physical scientists, engineers, mathematicians, particularly people involved in statistics and journalism. Edward Tufte, who's very well known as a statistics professor. That's where he came in. The second frame is the frame of graphic design, history of graphic design. Like in this history, time begins with modernist aesthetics in the 1920s. That's where time begins. You have things like New Typography by Tichol and History of Visual Communication. This is largely the Swiss school, and newness and freshness of style are located in qualitative values. The examples in this frame come from practitioners of graphic arts, printers, graphic designers, typographers, illustrators. A third frame is information design. And this is a history of the design for information transfer primarily. In frame two, the information designer exists as a subspecialty of graphic design. In frame three, it's basically the purpose of visual communication. In frame two, success can be felt through emotional impact. Success in frame three can be measured by functionality and usability. So in this type of information design, there's a great deal of studies, wayfinding, instructional design, signage systems, such as the one that's been recently redone in Châtelet. I don't know how many people here have found that they don't get lost in Châtelet as much as they did 10 years ago. So what I'm proposing here for the fourth frame, it looks at information design as a human activity that's practiced by cultures everywhere. It'll include the first three frames, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with these other histories. They're extremely useful, and people have done wonderful work in that. But more importantly, it includes information designs that are currently segregated into frames such as art history and archaeology, ethnography, and particularly the Western study of non-Western culture. These examples are collective strategies for visual logic, the many ways to transfer a chosen signal from sender to receiver. So I call this a new history because I want you to see information design as an action done for a purpose, to serve a function. I'm very fond of the number 9, so I'm very happy that I could organize this history into 9 functional themes. And the nine themes are cosmology and theological narrative, world, kingdom, and city maps, transportation diagrams, genealogy and lineage, timelines, scientific explanation, economic trends, mechanical controls, and engineering and business process. So perhaps the first function of information design is to describe our relationship to sacred space. When I enter this Romanesque church in Kahn, my attention is focused on the Last Judgment. The designer of this relief wanted to communicate to several audiences. Perhaps my attention is drawn to the figures right over the doorway. I'm particularly fond of the guy with the hammer there. Yeah. One of the highlights of Romanesque art. Am I going to heaven? That way? Am I going to hell over this way? I can immediately see a thin line between reward and punishment. Perhaps I've listened to Bible stories and the position of these visual groups reinforces my idea of good and evil. Or perhaps I'm a monk trained in Latin and I can read the text inscribed on the frames around the groups. The text message right over the doorway reads, "O sinners, know that unless you change your ways, there will be a hard judgment." I think one of the things that impressed me about this one, and there's of course many examples like this in France and Germany and several other parts of the region, is that the designers of this particular timpanum seem to have these two audiences in mind. On the one hand, you could understand it if you couldn't read the text, and on the other hand, the text reinforces exactly what's going on in the rest of the visuals. So I think we need to expand our preconception of where to find information design. So let me show you two places that expanded my sense of this. The first is Dunhuang. This is a man-made cave complex in central China. It was once a major entry point for the overland trade between China and the Western world. This is a photo that was taken a couple of winters ago. In the summer, it's really crowded with tourists at this point. So there are nearly 500 painted caves at this site, and they were created between the year 400 and 1400, so over 1,000 years in one place. But I'm just going to talk about one. I'm going to zoom into this particular cave that was dug out and painted in the year 950. It's known as Cave 61. So Cave 61 is shaped to appear like the interior of a large tent. These are not natural caves. These are caves that are dug into the cliff. So they manufactured this cave to look like a tent. It's based on models from India. And I'm just going to talk about a mural that's on the rear wall. It's about 50 feet long, so about the size of this wall, and about 12 feet high. And the central part is actually hidden behind a stone screen that connects the ceiling and the floor. So this is what the mural looks like today. I'm sorry about the lack of definition here, but hopefully we'll be able to see some of it when I get a little closer. It represents Wutaishan, which means Five Terrace Mountain. It's a famous pilgrimage site in central China. So I've drawn some outlines here so you can see the 5 peaks. And I've labeled them with the cardinal directions. The pilgrimage starts on a road over here on the left up the south peak, and then it continues from one peak to another. From the east peak, it exits from another town. When you stand in front of this wall, you can see how the painting represents 3 visual layers. There's a very stylized landscape background. At the top of this, basically literally painted on top of the landscape background, are people, animals, and buildings. And on top of this are place names and religious sayings. So you can see these rectangles that have some text in it. Those are placed on the next level. But someone must have acted as an overall designer, a director of the composition. And this designer used relative size to communicate information. So monks are always taller than lay people, and celestial beings are always much taller than monks. They also use location in space. So this entire composition is divided into 3 tiers. Roughly celestial beings along the top, pilgrims along the bottom, and priests are in the center. That celestial area is irregular. It's not exactly a rectangle. And it's penetrated by, the mountain peaks actually penetrate that celestial space. The marks in yellow here are some of the celestial emanations that descend down into the middle zone. And marks in red and blue show how the slants of the rooftops of the temples draw the viewer's eye into a curved space. So the roof lines all point upward at the start of the pilgrimage. The roof lines of the central temple create a peak that's aligned with the central mountain. And as you walk past the central mountain, the space starts to curve outward. And now the roof lines are all slanted downward, and it curves back towards us. And the composition ends at a walled gate that's similar to the one where it begins on the other side. So the viewer who's walked along this 50-foot mural has figuratively trekked over 150 miles and visited dozens of temples. When you walk this corridor behind the stone screen today, you can see and feel this curved space. But you need a flashlight. There's no natural light in this cave, and up close you can only see a few feet at a time. The images I've shown, what you've seen over here, are part of a digitization project where they've digitized all of the paintings in this cave. What function could it possibly serve to create a narrative map representing hundreds of figures and temples inside this cave? Some experts suggest that the cave was used for religious ceremonies and visitors gained merit by experiencing this virtual pilgrimage, right? So the virtual pilgrimage space. Others have pointed out that there's actually no evidence that people did this. There's a complete lack of soot from torches, and that suggests that once the cave was painted, it was never used. Perhaps the act of encoding the sacred narrative on the wall was the entire function of the design. The second example I want to bring up can be found over on the eastern side of Paris. Pelly de la Porteraie was created for the International Colonial Exposition in 1931. This event turned part of Paris into a theme park celebrating the French colonies around the world. The palace was the only building that was planned to be a permanent structure. While it's no longer a museum of the French colonies, the facade survives intact to the present day. Alfred Janiot designed the facade. His assignment was to represent the natural resources of what was then known as the Plus Grande France, Greater France. He chose the shallow bas-relief style he saw on fragments from Angkor Wat, which had been brought to Paris from Cambodia. These are 2 pieces of the elaborate composition that he created, combining images of plants and animals from the Museum of Natural History with photographs of people in local costume and live models that were brought to Paris. On the left is Janiot working on a panel about Dahomey, which is the modern Benin, one of his models. The people are gathering pine nuts and they're making palm oil. The next panel shows people gathering ivory, elephant ivory in Congo. And this right panel shows people farming rice and gathering coffee in Cochinchine, which is modern Vietnam. The compositions were modeled in clay in the studio. You can see Janiot over here working on the clay model. And then they were carved into stone blocks, and the blocks were reassembled and mounted on the building's facade. The sculpture represents the colonial subjects harvesting resources for France. The name of the colonies and the products are engraved in stone in the composition. I placed the names of the colonies on the top and the harvested products down here on the bottom in the sketch. The left side of the building represents the Caribbean and African colonies. Sugar, ivory, palm oil, and wood are being passed up to waiting ships and then brought to France. The right side represents Asia and the Pacific. Rice, pepper, rubber, tea, fish are being lifted upwards and carried to France. There's no mention of the French monopoly on the opium trade. In the center is a symbol of France, receiving ships from all directions. The French Republic takes the form of Europa and her bull surrounded by Greco-Roman goddesses. There are no French people in this facade. The original function of the design was to illustrate the economic benefit of the colonies to France. Today it functions as a catalog of plants, animals, and birds, indigenous population, and modes of production that existed in these parts of the world in the 1930s, and particularly those things that were valued by the French. And the result is this hybrid of natural history and the cosmology of colonialism. The second theme is world, kingdom, and city maps. A map is a diagram of a place. It shows us the physical relationship among the details, and it may or may not be based on any kind of consistent mathematical projection. I don't say this out of any disrespect for cartographers who understand it differently, but it's a broader notion of what a map is. And I propose that maps fulfill three major functions. World maps show us the relationships among the parts of the known world. And the known world can be of any size, depending on which group is talking about the world that they know. Al-Idrisi created this compendium of the known world for King Roger of Sicily. He gathered information from Greek, Roman, Arabic, Turkic, and Christian sources, and his map is oriented towards the south, with Mecca in the center. If we turn it around and we place north at the top, we can recognize the outline of the world we know today, the Mediterranean, Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. A kingdom map combines physical space and political influence to represent a part of the world. It shows us the shape and extent of our territory as separated from their territory. This image of Europe as a queen was an expression of the Habsburgs' claim to a kingdom known as the Holy Roman Empire. You can see major rivers and cities depicted within the female body. It's Bohemia in the center. And we can align a 20th century history map to see the corresponding areas. The crown is all of Iberia, the heart is Bohemia, the lower edge of the robe is the southern part of Greece, Morea. The third function of a map is to represent the urban center of civilization, the city. So I'm really happy to do this in the neighborhood. We worked over here on Rue des Archives, and I spent a great deal of time looking at this map, trying to identify the buildings in the neighborhood. Bertege actually measured every single building in the city. He was given a warrant by the governor and a small team of people, and they went to every building in the city of Paris in the 1730s, measured every building, counted the number of windows, which apparently was how you paid taxes at that time. So that was very important, how many windows you had facing the street as opposed to facing anything else. He used an isometric projection to record the architecture in one vertical scale. It's one of the things that's so impressive about this. All of the buildings are at the same vertical scale. So that nothing would block any view of the buildings, though, he flattened the city's hills. If you look at this map, you'll see that there is no Mont Saint-Geneviève or any of, and Montmartre is actually quite flat. He also widened the streets to expose the names of the streets. Right? As we know in this neighborhood, if you don't widen the streets, you'll never see any of the streets. So originally it was done on 20 copper plates like this. You can see how we widened some of these streets in order to get the names in. To make the city appear orderly, the streets are empty. But to represent commerce on the river is filled with boats. when you look at this, you keep the water and the land separate in your mind. And Bertege knew that, and he used it in an interesting way. He could use these separate scales for the city and for the river. So when you look at the map, you don't notice that those boatmen are giants. They're actually taller than the buildings. And if you were to put those boats next to the horlogerie, you would see that that boat is almost the size of the horlogerie. But when you look at the map, you don't notice that. So there are still many buildings in the city that appear on this map. When I worked in Paris, my office was in this building over here. It says Rue des Enfants Rouges, but that's Rue des Archives. And when you compare that to a current digital map, you can see how Bertege's distortions made the locations of the buildings and the streets a lot easier to understand. The third theme here is transportation diagrams. And these are diagrams that assist the viewer performing a universal task, getting from here to there. The primary function is to support travel decisions within a network. And those travel decisions differ depending on whether we're moving over land, over sea, or through an urban transportation system. So the Puttinger table illustrates how transportation diagrams benefit from a distortion that focuses on the network. The original is a set of 11 sheets that are about 1 foot high, and altogether it's 22 feet long. So that strip that you see along the top, this is the Puttinger table or the Puttinger map. You see it's a record of the Roman road network as it was around the year 250. I was actually in Jublan last week, which is a Gallo-Roman town that has a museum, and they've identified where Jublan is. This is not too far from Rennes. So this diagram shows how each of what you see down below here, how each of the 11 sheets covers different amounts of territory on the modern map. You can see how the roads closest to Rome, see where Italy is over there, sheets 3, 4, and 5, they have the most detail, while the sections that are farthest from Rome seem to have the least amount of detail. It's rather understandable. So this contemporary map actually shows all of the areas of the Roman world that are in the Puttinger map. The colored dots show the large number of locations reported on the map, and the lines show the roads that are represented. The horizontal map is oriented northeast to southwest, and that vertical space is compressed. This is done by essentially removing all of the space covered by water. You can't walk across the Mediterranean, so why waste the space, right? You also can't walk across the Adriatic or La Manche. So here's what the map looks like. Here's Canterbury in England. Here's Rennes in Brittany, Toulouse in the south of France, and Delos on the Algerian coast. So essentially they've compressed everything to fit it into 1 foot high. Right? The map also uses symbols to represent different types of towns and services for travelers. On the sheet, Rome is represented by a personified king. Travelers can also see where to find the temples, thermal baths, and some warehouses. So this map of the Paris subway line uses essentially the same compression of space. In the diagram above the train car door, which is a very narrow space, the two unconnected sections are shown as parallel lines. The two parts of the line diverge in real space, but that information isn't needed by most of the travelers on the train, so why waste the space? Transportation diagrams for urban networks, they became very important as cities grew in the end of the 19th century. By the early 1930s, the various electric railways that served London had merged into the underground, and underground maps began to resemble a plate of spaghetti. And then in 1933, the London Underground published this transportation diagram that was designed by Harry Beck, and it became the reference for all of the urban networks that followed. Beck essentially restricted the lines to horizontal and diagonal grids. This reduces the visual noise and that was created by many of these irregular lines and uneven spaces between the lines. I don't know how many of you have been to London, but the Thames River does not run at 45-degree angles, but it works very well in terms of how the diagram works. My colleague Joel Katz pointed out that Becks diagram was built around the appropriate unit of measure for this kind of a diagram, which is the stop. And so it's all based on how many stops there are on a line. The physical distance between the stations is distorted to make it easier for travelers to read the diagram. Becks spread out the stations in the center to make space for their names and decreased the space on the outlying stations so they would fit on the diagram. The amount of time that it takes to get from one station to another is relatively uniform, regardless of the actual space between them. So transportation diagrams contain information that's needed by the traveler that they're designed for. This sailing chart, as I explained a little bit before, it represents a useful contrast to a road map. The pattern of wood and shells on this chart represents the swells or the waves between the islands. This is the Marshall Islands. So a sailor would read the interactions between the landforms and the prevailing winds, and the chart summarizes the information that he needs to know before he travels on the ocean. These charts were not used while people were sailing. These charts were training charts for the people who would sail. So they would gather this information, they would memorize the chart, and then they would set sail. When you're sailing ships with deep hulls and much longer range, you need a different kind of information. You need compass headings and depth measurements. So this is from Wagner's book from the 16th century of all of the ports in the northern part of Europe. In his book on Northern Europe, everything is organized into 4 elements. You've got coastal silhouettes along the top, something you would see as you're cruising along the coast. Then you've got typical coastal silhouettes. You've got the typical scene you might see on the coastline. So where the sheep are, you see sheep. Where the cows are, you see some cows. And then you've also got run lines and depth measurements for approaching the land towards the specific harbors. The fourth theme here is genealogy and lineage diagrams. So these are records of descent relationships. The primary function is to represent inherited value, inclusion, or position in a religious, political, or cultural community. This is from the Nuremberg Chronicles, 1490s. This is a genealogy of Charlemagne. So this uses the organic metaphor of a vine connecting the emperor of the Franks with his ancestors. You can compare this to a modern descent diagram. Here's Saint Arluf. Here's Charles Martel. And here's Charlemagne. So I think one of the things that's interesting when you compare these is that those are the 3 most important lines of descent, 3 that I've highlighted here, and they're lined up over here on the left side of the vine diagram. If you treat it more rationally, it's much more complex. There's many other people to look at, but whoever designed this knew why they were choosing these 3. So lineage can also be shown by proximity with no connecting lines, as in these 3 paintings. This is a Tibetan Lama lineage. The current Lama is in the center with his predecessor at his feet. Milarepa on the left is the teacher of Gyampopa on the right. And they're each surrounded by predecessors and descendants. And it can also be implied by a linear progression. Rudolf Zallinger, who is a very important scientific illustrator working in the US, developed this diagram called The Progress of Man in 1965. He used different postures and body hair to represent the evolution of the human animal. He also put representative tools in the hands of some of those ancestors. You see that modern man in 1965 has a very recent haircut, but he's not carrying his cell phone yet. So maps and transportation diagrams illustrate space, and the purpose of a timeline is to represent relationships in time. The European timelines that begin in the 18th and 19th century struggle to synthesize competing views of time. One of the most influential is this diagram by Joseph Priestley called the New Chart of History, which synthesizes events found in classical texts and modern history, meaning up through the end of the 18th century. It begins in 1200 BC with Egyptians and Israelites. The vertical dimension over here are modern nations, and that basically it represents the rise and fall of empires through the 1800s, through 1800 basically. He applied color to group together the parts of the empires that spanned current nations, so we can see the Roman Empire spanning. Roman Empire is that green thing that you see there. You can see it spanning Africa and Europe and skipping over China, India, and Persia. And along the bottom, he's got a list of famous people, too, so you can align people with time. Frederick Strauss's Streams of Time show ancient civilizations beginning around 1,500 years after the creation of the world, which is emerging out of the clouds on the top there. And the streams flow into a stomach shape that's the Roman Empire, and then it diverge into modern nations. Civilizations flow from 9 streams. We've got Italian, Greek, Asia Minor, Syrian, Phoenician, Jews, Egyptians, Chinese, and along with the stream are famous people, and then the American translation of this, which happened in the 1830s, adds inventions and cities. Another really interesting American example is Emma Willard. So this is a woman who was one of the pioneers of women's education in the United States. She created history textbooks that were part of this broad educational program for educating women. She designed this architectural memory palace. The pillars that you see here are centuries. They're holding up a ceiling that's covered by categories of famous people. The back wall was the year of creation, which is 4004. Up through this period in mid-19th century, the world began in the year 4004 BC. That had been clearly established. And the empires flow along the floor where she adds a glowing star to mark the birth of Christ. And the modern nations are in the foreground. And here we see the English and Spanish empires parting to reveal the Republic of America. Here in yellow. The winter count tradition among the people of the North American plains was another way of representing time. This is Lone Dog's winter count. It's painted on a buffalo robe. A year was recorded by designing a mnemonic pictogram to represent the significant events of that single year, and they were organized in a spiral. This is another winter count that's drawn in ink and colored pencil on cotton. These are materials that people had when they were confined to reservations and prisons. So many of the examples that we have are drawn this way while people were incarcerated. There was a market for collecting collecting winter counts in the late 19th century, early 20th century. There's phonetic transcriptions of the Dakota language here that's been added to pictograms. This gives you some idea of how a literate person would read this. Each of those pictograms represents a word or a phrase, which represents the significant event of that particular year. Some of these go back into the early 1700s. As scientific concepts of time expanded the past from thousands to millions to billions of years, the scale of time changed radically, so that in the 20th century, the scientific timeline had to synthesize geological time, fossil records, and notions of evolutions of plants and animals, as well as theories of the formation of the stars and the planets. Herbert Bayer, one of the great designers from the Bauhaus, designed this World Geographic Atlas, and it covered science as well as geography. For that timeline in the upper right-hand corner of that two-page spread, which he titled The Succession of Life, he controls the time scale, which is 3,000 million years. Which the theory was this is the time since the formation of the planet Earth, 3,000 million years. By designing this outward-facing spiral that unfolds into a grid, nice tight spiral, so we don't waste too much time with all that time where life doesn't exist, into a grid. And then on the grid, we've designed a parallel development for animal life, plant life, and geological time from the Cambrian to the present. And this spiral approach, representing vast periods of time, has influenced a lot of current timelines. There's quite a few examples of this now. You can see near the center, you see that one little red spot up there, that's man in the center over there. So when we think of scientific explanation, let's think of it as embracing the recording of direct observation of phenomenon. So I'm not going to argue about scientific method here, but I'm saying that scientific explanation is you observe something and you're trying to communicate directly what you've observed. One of the richest themes here is depicting human anatomy. So Al-Haytham, who is a native of Basra in Iraq, drew this diagram of the human visual system. This was done in the 11th century. So he's showing the eyes and the related nerve system in a book of optics, which he produced at that time. And he used this diagram to explain how the eyes received reflected light, were focused through the lens. The Persian physician Mansur created these color-coded diagrams of the separate systems of human anatomy. We're looking directly into the human body here. The arterial and nervous system are viewed from behind on the left, and the major organs and body circulation are viewed from the front, over here on the right. Medical practice was also very important in the Tibetan monastic tradition. Sangye Gyamtso's treatise, which is from the 17th century, illustrated similarly the overlapping systems of the body. On the left is the moxibustion and surgery and bloodletting points. And on the right is the anatomy of the body's most vulnerable points. Actually was able to find a really good reproduction of one of these by a French Tibetanologist who described what was going on here, that this man was essentially he was the prime minister of Tibet at this time. And he decided that he needed to unify the medical practices, and so he gathered information from all the different doctors as to where they thought things were and how things were supposed to be treated, and he created this uniform medical treatise. When you get up close, you can see how he combines 2- and 3-dimensional views to represent both the surface and the interior. So this is a book, but it was also done as a series of paintings, and a number of the paintings survive in 2 or 3 different places. So another medical doctor, Fritz Kahn, no relation, not related to Fritz Kahn. He was a medical doctor in Germany and a popular science writer, and he was a master of using mechanical metaphor to explain how the body works. He also employed homunculus. These are the little people inside your head and the other organs that are doing the work and the thinking for you. I'm not sure where this word comes from, but there is a word for this. It's homunculus. And he used this to describe biochemical processes. And Joel Katz also employs a similar metaphor of pipes and fluid dynamics to represent the cardiovascular system. This is an approach that Katz uses, and he's a master of transportation diagrams, so you get a sense of where his influences come from. He does medical diagrams. We use information to design our experiments, sometimes very literally. This is one of my favorite experiment illustrations. That's Antoine Lavoisier employing a solar furnace to burn a diamond so that he can measure the gas that comes out. He burns the diamond. This was actually done at the Louvre. Sometimes we're a little less literal and more abstract. So the language of scientific explanation absorbed many elements that are already established in the language of theology. This is the Nuremberg Chronicle again, and this is the 6 days of creation. You see that hand on the upper left, which is a visual code for God's act of creation. These hands appear as vectors in this vectors of action in Galvani's illustration of his experiments with animal electricity. So that hand, which also seems to have migrated to the Macintosh, this hand over here, is some notion of a vector of action. Put the action in there. Sometimes you can combine the two. The hand appears here among other realistic figures and mathematical abstractions in Simon Staden's book, The Principles of the Art of Waiting. This is arguably the first book that combines abstract and illustration in order to explain mathematical or scientific principles. Staven understood our ability to combine a depiction of what we can see, you can see those people, with the abstraction of what you can think to explain scientific concepts. So even though those men are carrying abstract rectangles, we can feel the difference in the weight, slope. Sometimes you combine everything into a single image. This is Alexander von Humboldt synthesizing his natural history observations from 4 years in South America into a single chart to communicate a visual understanding of the concept of ecology, how everything is related. When you take a closer look at the diagram, you get to see more and more detail. These are the names of the plants and the locations and the altitude on the mountain where he found them. And this omniscient point of view influenced many, many diagrams, such as these representations of the major mountain and river networks of the world. On the right, we have the peaks in America, Asia, Africa, and Europe, organized by altitude. So this notion that you can take things and just pull them into a diagram and lay them all out really comes from this omniscient point of view. And we can also see how high Humboldt climbed when he was climbing the Andes. And we can see how Gay-Lussac's balloon ascent compares to the peaks of the Sierra Nevadas and the Himalayas by doing this. So a more contemporary one, Antonio Petrocelli's science diagrams from the 1960s, they owe a great deal to this omniscient point of view that was introduced by Humboldt. Like Staven, he explains the world by combining visible details such as rainbows and radio telescopes, things you could actually see, with invisible abstractions like ionized molecules and radio waves. So the remaining three functions are a response to the need to begin, the need that began with our migration from animal to mechanical energy. The entire notion of economic trends requires the development of two things. You need longitudinal data corresponding to political units or business sectors, and I've often been surprised by the fact that these just don't exist before the 1700s. There are no longitudinal data. They're contemporary. There are things that have been reconstructed since, but at the time no one had data sets about how much money there was in this country versus that country. And you also need a belief that visual patterns had a value beyond the numbers that they were based on. So from the later 18th century, there were several people that proposed methods to turn these numbers into visual patterns. William Playfair charted import and export time series as overlapping lines to show his audience the balance of trade. If you look closely at this chart for the balance between England and North America, I'll redraw the dates on the bottom so you can see them better. The import and export drops dramatically in the years before the American Revolution. 1776 is the revolution. So that's where the balance of trade changes, and then during the war years, the imports drop even more while the exports go up and down. German, at the same time, August Krome, compared the area and the population of each part of Europe to explain a theory of national wealth and power. He organized them into nested boxes from the tiny city-states of San Marino up on there on the top, the enormous Russian Empire. And at the bottom of the chart are circles that compare 20 nations. These circles are surface areas of states. Sweden's on the far left, then European Turkey, then Portugal. The British Empire is over here on the far right. Those green tangents on the upper right are people living in the states, that's the population. You see that Sweden's territory is large, but its population is small. The yellow tangents on the left are public revenues of the state. You see that Britain's revenues dwarfs other states. The English were making a lot of money. And the blue lines are average public revenue contributed by citizens, and we see that the English were also paying very high taxes. So Charles Joseph Menard, another remarkable Frenchman, developed a series of what he called cartes figuratives. We translate this as representative maps, using geography to frame the flow of people and goods. This one shows in green the quantity of grain imported to France from Russia and Ottoman Turkey by sea. So the green is everything that's traveling by boat. And it's compared to the overland trade of grain from Austria and Spain in red. What's interesting about Menard's work is that he freely distorts that geography so that the data can flow through the Bosporus. The Bosporus isn't quite that wide, but there's a lot of grain that needs to flow through it, so he opens it up. We can visualize relationships by shading geographical units to represent differences in quantity. Kahn used shading to show differences in concentration in specific sections of Paris. And he associated the darkest shade with the least desirable outcome. In this case, the darkest section has the largest number of prostitutes. The guy who really brought most of the visual language that we use today to the fore is a man named William Stanley Jevons. He had this approach to visualizing fluctuations of value, and it's a clear bridge between scientific explanation and economic trends. Essentially, Jevons treated fluctuations in value in the same way that you would treat fluctuations in temperature or rainfall. They all had the same, they were all the same, right? And so it didn't really matter whether you were looking at the amount of rain or the amount of wind, or whether you were looking at the price of fodder or the price of gold. They were treated as objective data that was created by the market, in this case. And this would give birth to Charles Dow's ideas of an average of individual stock prices that represents the health of this abstraction called the market as a single line. But the visualization of economic trends doesn't need to be neutral by any means. It was 35 years after the emancipation when W.B. Du Bois created these charts for the audience of the Paris International Exhibition in 1900. His purpose was to make a previously invisible part of the American population visible to the world. We can't ignore the polemic drive for attention that emerges from the diagrams themselves. So this is 1900. They look rather like modern art, but it's just because we've seen a lot of modern art that they look like modern art. This chart shows the uneven growth of taxable property owned by African Americans in the state of Georgia. 10 years after the emancipation, it's 5.4 million. There's 5 years of a small growth followed by a larger growth between 1880 and 1890, and then 10 years of very tiny growth. The total numbers appear like spikes driven into the chart's center. One of the most striking charts is this representation of urban and rural population. The urban population is divided into 3 categories of different size cities: green for large, blue for medium, yellow for small. The direction of the line shifts with the color. Then Negroes living in the country and villages, whose numbers actually represent 86% of the total, are represented in this tight spiral at the bottom. This is a piece of evidence from the Peugeot Committee Money Trust report. It's translating an enormous amount of data into a single linked node diagram. This is a report by the US Senate about the way in which J.P. Morgan and his banks were controlling the US economy. The purpose of the diagram was to show that, and the capital value of each company is the size of the circle, and the colored lines are the types of relationships to the Morgan Trust. So in the center, you see a ring of banks that are connected to industries that include railroads, metals, telegraph, and insurance companies. And those connections are encoded by different types of colored lines to show how each company shares one or more directors or trustees with the banks that are controlled by J.P. Morgan. You can also turn numbers into symbols and make them tell stories. Autonightrod created this isotype technique to tell complex visual stories by communicating quantity through repeated units, using bold outline and clear contrast. This particular chart shows the shift from home weaving to factory labor and how it affected the number of weavers and the production of cloth. In 5 rows, we can easily see the ratio of factory weavers, the red are the factory weavers, eliminating the home weavers, those are the black. And the key to explain all of this is at the bottom. But you can explain it without, you basically can see it without looking too hard at the numbers. You can turn it into numbers. Those blue symbols that represent the cloth, each blue symbol represents 50 million pounds of cloth. Black symbols represent 10,000 home weavers. The red, 10,000 factory weavers. Sorry. So you can see that over this time period, the number of weavers actually does decrease, but the home weavers are completely subsumed by the factory. So with the introduction of mechanical power, when operators can't hear or see or feel what they need in order to control the machines, they need sensors and they need some kind of visual presentation. The instruments that appear on the vehicle dashboards and control rooms for large mechanical systems, they generally communicate 2 things: status and quantity. So in order to control a machine, like this one, the driver of a steam-powered vehicle needed to control pressure, which controlled velocity. Eugene Bourdon invented this pressure gauge that provided real-time feedback to visualize pressure quantity through a needle's position on a circular dial. So the expanding pressure in that tube indirectly moves the needle. Before he invented this, there was no visualization when you were using a steam engine. So the pressure gauges allow the driver of a steam locomotive to see and adjust that fluctuation of pressure in the valves. Likewise, when you had a carriage driver, when your carriage was driven by a horse, you didn't need a lot of controls. You could feel your speed and you could feel what was going on. But the operator of an automobile needed some visual feedback when he could no longer feel what was happening. The only visual display on the first Model T Ford, so this was the first American car, was an ammeter over here that indicated whether the battery was working or not. So Otto Schultz in Germany, who was also a clockmaker, just like Bourdon was a clockmaker, invented the speedometer in Europe, in Germany. It reported distance traveled and velocity through rotating electromagnet that's winding a spring. And this became standard equipment on automobiles only after there were many fatal accidents. There was about a period of 10 or 15 years when these were available, but they weren't put into automobiles. Sometime in the 1920s, they finally became standard equipment. The rest of the dashboard fills out with oil pressure and fuel gauge and a clock, and the addition of heating and air conditioning, as well as radios and other entertainment features, completes the analog control through the 20th century. We also need sensors. You know, when we need additional sensors, we need additional displays. So aircraft actually, as complicated as those cockpits look, aircraft essentially have 6 basic instruments. These are the basic 6. There's airspeed and vertical speed and altimeters that are all driven by gauges that are pressure sensors. And then there's gyroscopes that communicate the plane's pitch and direction in relation to the horizon. The solution for monitoring potentially catastrophic activities like space flight or power plants is a hierarchical arrangement of status and quantity displays. This is an image from the Apollo era NASA mission control. Illustrates how mechanical controls were broken down into a hierarchy of components that are arranged in a theater. So each person is at a console that was assigned to monitor individual sensors, and the directors in the back receive that aggregated information. And actually the displays have not changed very much. The main thing that has changed in the control rooms are that there's actually women who are working there now, and some of the displays have well, they have color, right? They have color, but otherwise this setup works today, and it's quite similar to the way things are done in large power plants. Analog dials and gauges are the primary engineering metaphor to visualize numbers and their thresholds. So digital displays still tend to communicate this continuous change of numeric value by simulating dials and bar gauges. This is a control display for directional drilling, also known as fracking. So this is when you're drilling for gas or oil, and you can actually drive the direction of the drill underground. What you see here, the central dial indicates the direction of the drill, and it's surrounded by dials that indicate quantity values coming from signals in the drilling package. And the threshold of each signal is mapped in green, yellow, and red areas of the dial. So you can see that different dials have different green, yellow, or red thresholds. So it's easy to aggregate that. And you can create digital displays that are driven by electronic rather than physical connections, and they can create this kind of marketing information where that guy doesn't get dirty at all. He's got his suit on and he's monitoring all the drilling that's going on in various parts of the world. So the last group here is engineering and business process, and I put them together because they share similar functions and visual language. Pre-industrial depictions of machines are essentially descriptive, such as these images. This is the military devices on the left from Italy, and methods for exploiting silk production on the right from China. The reproduction of the machines was a task of craftspeople who had tools and skills and knowledge to reproduce what they needed. So you didn't need to create a diagram to tell them what to do. You could create a representation of the machine, and the people with the tools knew how to make the machine. Manufacturing driven by mechanical power required interchangeable parts. The person who designed the machine was not building it. So the designer and the builder were now separated, and the person building it was no longer the person who was operating it. When Gaspard Monge developed this technique of descriptive geometry, the French state actually understood its potential use and declared it a state secret. And so when his work didn't appear in print until after the French Revolution. And then his methods were used to reproduce engineering information throughout the world. William Farish in Britain introduced this notion of the isometric diagram. As a simple method for drawing machine parts, you needed only 3 tools, which are the 3 you see over here on the upper left, in order to do this. And he explained how to combine proportional elements to show how gears and other machine parts fit together. This is the illustration from the first article on isometric drawing, and that is an imaginary machine. The closer you look at it, the more you can't figure out what it's actually doing. But he designed this machine through isometric drawing and showed you how to design any machine. So engineering or mechanical drawing, it quickly developed this rich visual vocabulary of lines and projections and symbols in the early 20th century. There's an entire alphabet of lines here in William French's manual from 1912, I think. 1912. And these could be combined to draw any kind of a machine. Industrialization also created larger and more complex business organizations. The railroads turned out to be the gating example. You had a business that was spread over hundreds of miles, and they were the first businesses to use telegraph to create command and control systems. Again, after there were several head-on collisions. Right? They figured out that they really needed to keep track of where the trains were and what direction they were going. So when David McCallum became the general manager of the New York and Erie Railroad, this was at the time the largest railroad in the United States, he was managing 5,000 employees, which is still a pretty good business, right? Managing 5,000 people. This chart actually shows the position and reporting structure for every single employee. Uses this wonderful metaphor of growing from the roots of the board of directors, down on the bottom there. The organization opens up like a plant with 5 major trunk lines, and it shows the facilities as well as all of the employees on each one. And it's using the metaphor of trunk lines because literally there were 5 trunk lines on the railroad, so the basic 5 lines there that you see were the physical distances that the railroad was covering. For consumer products to spread, the ergonomic dimensions of the product needed to be specified and or standardized. This is from Ruth O'Brien's pioneering work to standardize the measurement of women's clothing. This kind of standardization was important for the clothes manufacturing process in the United States. This is from the 1940s. Without this, you would never know whether you could fit into a size 2 or a size 8. This is literally where women's sizes, the dresses comes from. And this was done by gathering large population, measuring hundreds of different people, and then standardizing the measures from that. There's a similar visual language that's been adapted for communicating business strategy. This drawing is by Walt Disney. And it describes his business strategy to use properties from his films to feed and reinforce all the parts of his media business. If you zoom in there, you can see, you follow Mickey at the right. We can read his directions for building synergies. TV publicizes products for the music division. Music helps kick off films. Creative talent from the films provide characters to merchandise licensing. And he's created dozens of mutually reinforcing cycles to build the value of the corporation. Information architecture diagrams for large websites provided another form of business strategy. This is a diagram from an early website for Nature magazine, the science magazine. The main diagram uses this isometric projection to show the structure of the site, which was inspired by the Turgot map. I know that because I worked on it. That's where we got the idea. And those color elevations are used to represent some critical business issues, the different levels of access to the content given by registered users and paid subscribers. The turning of a dial also became a metaphor for interacting with electronic devices such as console radios. Electrical engineers developed their own visual language to describe and replicate what was going on inside an electronic device. So these wiring diagrams, with their symbols for electronic components, were effectively inspired by Becks' London Underground diagram. And Becks' London Underground diagram was that way because he was an electrical engineer. So finally, these engineering and logic diagrams become templates for experience and service design visualizations. And this is being done to support business strategy, right? Shostak, Lynn Shostak's diagram. This logic diagram, this is the first instance of a service blueprint. This is the first article describing service blueprints. That line of visibility near the top separates the discount brokerage customers, what they see from the business processes needed to support them down below. And her black circles there indicate multiple fail points in the process. So this form of business engineering inspired a host of different techniques. This is an example of a customer journey map that's reproduced in Jim Kalbach's book on mapping experiences, which I highly recommend. So you've got a line of, again, you've got the line of visibility of the back office processes and the front office processes and the different channels. So, this is the 9 functional themes, and I think they're a useful way to think about and discuss the variety and unity of information design examples across time. There's a wonderful phrase in Henri Chapelain's preface to the Atlas Historique, 1705, I think. He describes these engravings of coastlines and political boundaries as an aid to provide the imagination through the eyes. The human imagination is not an empty space to be filled with data. It contains more than the set of rational numbers and operates through a constantly changing network of connections. We perform the creative act of information design in order to communicate the imagination through the eyes. It's easy to see how we can collectively come to identify data visualization as the sole source of information design, but I really think it's a mistake. Our biggest challenge today is not learning how to write software programs to make use of all the data. Our biggest problem today is mastering the quantities that we record. The tools we use to shape data into images don't explain how meaning is transmitted. The psychological rules for optimizing perception don't explain the multiplicity of information design strategies that people have devised over the centuries. Our biggest challenge is learning how to select and shape information to make meaning. And reviewing information design history can help gain perspective on how qualitative and quantitative information are both part of information design today. Thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to take questions. Though if people need to take off, feel free to take off. Take off.
Hi, thank you. Maybe I talk back. Thank you for your presentation. At the beginning, you mentioned data visualization, graphic design, information design, and global information design.
Yeah.
I think I can distinguish what global information design is from the three others. But I'm not sure how would you say data visualization is different from graphic design and graphic design from information design? I mean,
information design?
Yeah. How do you make a difference between those three?
Well, I think the difference is largely driven by the different audiences that are focused on them. That is, let's take graphic design. People who are focused on graphic design are not statisticians per se, and they're not necessarily scientists. They're interested primarily in visual style and visual communication. And so their sense of the history of where they come from is largely influenced by the designers that inspire them. When you talk about data visualization, you're generally talking about people who are primarily focused on data visualization. So there's many data visualization scientists who've come up with ways of managing the numbers, and there are people who are very interested in different forms of visual things that can be driven by the data. Okay? If you look at some of the really interesting modern graphic information graphic designers, they're somewhere, they're a mixture of these things. They're generally not creating things that are purely driven by the numbers. So it's not an algorithmic transformation. It makes much more reference to your sense of visual culture and what that visualization references. There is this subspecialty of information design, and people who work in that field often work in signage and design for the pharmaceutical industry. Those when you open up a drug and there's a piece of paper in it, you throw it away. There's an entire industry that designs those things that you throw away, and they have to have exactly the right information. And other types of instructional designers, they're less interested in the visual qualities than they are in the measurable effect of whether they've communicated the right amount of information. So I think there's different balances in terms of where people find value, whether they are focused on the emotional impact. Right? Generally, when you're working in data visualization, you're trying to come up with elegant ways of turning numbers into pictures. And the intellectual impact of that is less interesting than the intellectual challenge of coming up with another way of turning numbers into pictures. Okay. I'm not sure if I explained that too well, but that's what I think about it. Anyone else have any challenges? Please.
Do I need the mic? Hi, does it work?
Yeah, you're waiting.
I don't know if it's a question, I don't know how to put it. So there was this show at the EDF Foundation, if I can say it right, a few months ago about data visualization specifically. And some really fantastic work, more specifically on the data viz part, I'd say. And I was thinking there's this, I think you might have heard about it. So Jonathan Harris is a data designer, or I don't know exactly what it is, more on the artistic part than the functional part, I'd say. But he's been doing over the years different experiments using like digital data of all sorts, tweets, videos, anything you can really find online, but some like new types of content that we have today, to create different experiments, how to mix that together. And it's, I was in the grade that you had on the different categories, I'm thinking I can't find a place to put him. I don't know if it's because it's more maybe on the artistic, the experience part, but what he's doing, for example, at this show, there was this installation that he did where basically you're going through thousands of videos, text, tweets, pieces of articles, all mixed together, that you can browse for 7 minutes only. But it's like mind-blowing, and it kind of gives you, it's chaotic but organized, and gives you a sense of like what we are today, the humanity. But I don't know where it fits actually.
So where would it fit? So first let me say that these nine categories are proposed as a useful way of thinking about the possibility. Right? I'm not suggesting that this is it. Everything has to fit. I'm not a professor. I don't have tenure. I don't have to do things like that. But I could say that, and I've seen similar types of installations. So I haven't seen the one you're talking about, but I think I understand. I guess what I'm proposing is that is interesting, that's interesting or useful to you, the viewer, if it's serving a function. So you could ask, well, what function did that one serve? It's not telling you how to get to someplace. Perhaps it's giving you some idea of sort of the whole space or the known world, or perhaps it's expressing some kind of cosmology to you. But in order to be a useful information design in the terminology that I'm speaking about, you would have to provide some function. I'm not including aesthetic pleasure as a function, because I don't see that as fundamental to information design history. There's many ways you can create aesthetic pleasure. So it's kind of it's a very good question. I'm not entirely sure how to deal with the fact that as a manager of digital information, and you can turn this digital information into different types of visualizations, as well as space that you can navigate through and find, and I have a number of students who do this, whether the function of this is, so if I had here's an example that I've often fantasized about. If I had digital information about every place that I have been from the time that I was born until right now, I would love to have a map of the world that has that as an overlay, so that when I walk into a city like Paris, which I've been in for many years, I could see the places that I've never been. But I think about that in a functional term. Right? But if we all had a map like that, and you could, and you might use it for any number of different purposes. Right? So I don't really want to look at all of the photographs that have ever been taken in front of the Tour Eiffel, but you could find every photograph that's ever been taken in front of the Tour Eiffel and turn it into some kind of a data visualization.
There was actually something like that, taking Instagram pictures, and when you go, you could zoom in, and you had like this giant map for themes and locations where you could see like almost sometimes the same pictures taken.
I'm sure the same picture exactly has been taken.
It's like,
I remember in Jevons many years ago, I thought to myself, you could just set up something that sucked all of the information out of every camera into this one place, and then you could have every photograph that everyone has ever taken in Giverny, and you could turn that into an interesting project. But whether you could turn that into an interesting information, how you would turn that into something that would be functional in an information design, useful in that functional sense, I'm not really sure. But we've got a lot of possibilities. A lot of great tools. Yeah.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for great presentation. I'm a huge admirer of what you do. My problem is that I would really love to apply a lot of these principles, but I'm coming from a very textual world, a world of long books or reports or verbal type things. So distinctly non-visual. So I wonder if you have any experiments or experiences that you can share with us of how information design has been used to convey, I guess, non-quantitative type and non-visual type information.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or if I'm just telling you a good answer. But in the work, in that last section on business process and service design, what I found to be extremely useful is to use service design methodology to actually see what people are doing and how they're doing it, rather than, you can summarize these things in reports, but if you can create a visualization of the actual process, you can often create a common mental model that people within the business community who are coming at it from different agendas and different points of view, they can see what is actually happening, they can see where their decisions interact with someone else's decisions. So that type of visualization is qualitative, but it's often based on good quantitative research. Right? So it's not just let's draw a picture of what everybody said, but trying to interview a lot of people, analyze what they're doing, align them according to some useful dimensions, whether that dimension is time or channels or systems that they're using. I think that's a good way of creating visualizations. That example that I showed from the Peugeot report, I guess it's 1912, there is in that report a spreadsheet that is about the size of this wall. I couldn't believe when I downloaded it how many sheets they had pasted together. And that big spreadsheet was this same information. It was all of the information about all of the people who were on the boards of trustees of all these different companies and all of the values that they had and what the business relationships were. And if you looked at that spreadsheet, all the data was there, but it was very difficult to follow.
Meaningless, yeah.
Right? Well, it's not meaningless, but it was difficult. You could see the detail. If you found where you could find the XY coordinate, you found exactly what you needed. But someone had looked at that and said, there's another pattern that we could create from that information, and it would be easier to visually see. I think the most unifying thing about all of these examples is that they are visual communication. And the ideal for any of these diagrams, whether it's for transportation or for scientific use or for business use, is that you can synthesize visually what you want to get across in a space that someone can actually see with their eyes. Right? We had some experiences in doing information architecture and some of these other diagrams for large companies, and there's a few simple rules that you learn. One is that if you make a diagram that's very high, it's really difficult for people to see it because they have to get down like this to look at the details and so on. So you generally want to make things that are wider than they are high for people to visually be able to scan them and understand them. But again, you have to make it at a scale that a person can actually grasp. I think what's interesting, or what's perhaps interesting or ironic, is that many of these cosmology diagrams the ones that I showed and many others that I found, are almost impossible to see. all at once. It's as if that somehow was part of the design. Right? All the information is there, but if you go into some of these Mayan temples and you look at the murals, you actually can't see the mural all at once. You have to move from here to here, and you have to remember where you are and move to someplace else. But if you're trying to get across, if you got a 150-page report and you want people to understand it, it would be really great if you could just make something about this big. Make them understand it. Any questions?
Can I make a small comment?
Please.
On your NASA, Apollo 11,
Yeah.
there are more women now. But do remember Margaret Hamilton, who actually coined software engineering. She was responsible for the actual software that made the calculation for the Voyager. So
Yeah. Well, there were many women involved. There's just none in the photographs.
Yeah.
They're not in the control room. They were doing absolutely essential work.
I think she was often in control, but maybe not in the photographs.
Not in the photographs that I have. It's a superficial comment. So. Well, there's refreshments. Please enjoy. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.